pops up.
Let's get into it. 1, 2, 3. Let's get some more. Have your hands. Some more. Let's get some more.
Why, hello, and welcome to My Whiskey Den, your favorite public access whiskey review show where craft whiskey is king and home of the Fat Boy Tasting Notes. And this evening, we are really happy to have Brian Cushing back on the show with us. If you don't know his channel, you should get over to the Victorian Barroom on Instagram, Facebook. You're not on the Twitter, are you?
Not on the Twitter. Yeah, we got Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
Yeah, I was going to say that was a bit much for us, and I think they also renamed it, which was a little bit weird. But you have got to go over there and check that out because the period pieces that he does are fantastic. The cocktails, and also you guys are working on an absinthe documentary, are you not?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. We always love
I'm
watching.
all excited. Sorry, got all wound up.
What's that?
I just got all wound up. Sorry, Brian.
Oh, no. I just want to say thanks. It's always a blast watching the show, and it's even more fun to be on. But yeah, the absinthe documentary about the 1830s, Switzerland County absinthe that Alan Bishop, he's one who came up with that research and brought it to my attention. Then we started working on this together. But yeah, we've wrapped shooting. I've actually been making meaningful progress on editing. And so I'm hoping late summer, early fall, we're actually going to see the thing.
Oh, it sounded fantastic. Oh, thank you everyone in the chat for being here and being on time. We really appreciate it. Well, Mitch is off hunting for things. Before we get moving a second further, do you want to tell people about the Bar Cart Co-op?
I will be happy to tell people about the Bar Cart Co-op while Mitch pops in and out.
I thought he was going down for seconds.
All right. The Bar Cart Co-op is a collection of friends who create content for the whiskey and other distilled spirits public. The YouTube and Facebook pages have information about upcoming and past special shows, which happen about every quarter. There's been blind tastings, distiller panels, discussions of special collaborations, and usage of unique grains. Bar Cart Co-op has educational and fun episodes for your enjoyment. They actually did two back-to-back. We did one with Chris Koenig, and then prior to that did Limestone Branch and the let's see, the rye that we all long for, the rye malt that is no longer there. I'm trying to find a good way to say it without sounding like I'm a whiny little person. But please go and check out the Facebook pages for those special shows. There should usually one every quarter. Then we also have Distillers Talk, which is the oldest show in the group, hosted by Alan Bishop and Christy Atkinson. It's a conversation with people from distilleries and distillery adjacent, getting into the weeds with their interviews. New episodes arrive at the end of the work week. And if you don't think Distillers Talk is nerdy enough, check out One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. This is a show where Alan Bishop answers any questions about distilling and often puts them to the test. It could be individual grains, mash bills, equipment, and methodology. New episodes come out randomly, so subscribe on YouTube and sit back and enjoy. Then we have Bourbon Turntable, where they mix the love of music with the love of whiskey. Kevin and Drew have a conversation with musicians, writers, distillery folks, and common folks like us about, you guessed it, music and whiskey. It releases every Wednesday on all of your platforms, including YouTube. And occasionally they do a live episode like they did last Wednesday. And they did one on 7 bad words of whiskey and music with words that people love, like smooth and artisanal. and they covered that quite well. And then finally, we do have If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything, which is a show about spirits and paranormal among us, as well as the unexplained and the spiritual. Subscribe on Spotify to get all 3 seasons. And then upcoming, we don't have a start date or anything yet, but I believe Whiskey in My Wedding Ring with David Levine is going to be coming on board with the Bar Cart Co-op.
You can breathe now. That was pretty good. How you do? See, everyone is doing well there. Mitch, you're back with us. That's awesome to see. But Brian, like I said, really excited to have you back, and because I wanted to talk about cocktails, and when discussing stuff with you, you said why not bring it back to kind of the beginning of a lot of cocktails, and I couldn't agree more. Plus, this is something in most every whiskey drinker's wheelhouse, and I think it's neat to go back as far as you did and see how it kind of originated and evolved, like we're going to discuss. So thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. This is exciting. I've been looking forward to it. Should we go ahead and mix one up?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
This is not the most earth-shatteringly exciting drink you're ever going to have, but the relevance to the broader world of mixology just kept coming up to me, and so I thought that maybe it would be worth discussing on here. So this is going to be mixed in a shaker and strained into a glass. I have this recipe is from 1862 from the original Jerry Thomas. The idea goes back at least to the very early 19th century. But this is the whiskey cocktail. It's pretty easy. He says to strain it into a fancy wine glass. This is a larger wine glass from around the same time Jerry Thomas was writing, been in the middle of the 19th century. So I'm going to try that. You need some gum syrup. If you don't have gum syrup, simple syrup will work as well. And he says 3 to 4 dashes of that. Now, usually I use the pretty easy to get a hold of kind of cork bottom, copper top dashers, but the gum syrup is too thick to pass through that. And so through trial and error, there we go. I've discovered that's about half a teaspoon. So about half a teaspoon in there. We're going to do a few dashes of Boker's Bitters, which was popular at the time, kind of died out in the early 20th century, and has been brought back by some people. You can usually order it online, but if you can't find Boker's, you can still get a good cocktail from Angostura. Okay, we're going to do 2 ounces of whiskey. It does not specify what kind of whiskey. Tonight, just for fun, I'm using Jim Beam's Old Tub, which is their revival of their earlier brand. Talking to Patrick, we said we could do a whole show on how close these may or may not be to the originals. But they're fun to work with for this kind of thing. And I can't get the cork out. Yeah. There we go. So 2 ounces of our whiskey. Okay, we're just going to put some ice in there, and this one gets shaken.
So, Brian, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Is all of your barware period correct?
It's kind of an amalgamation of what I've collected over time, but the neat thing is the basic forms have not changed much since the end of the 19th century. So it's like, yeah, we've got stainless steel, whereas they did not. This is a silver-plated cocktail shaker that I found, but the basic forms were really developed in the 19th century. So I kind of have a mix based on what I've been able to find. I also like people to be able to kind of see it, be able to recreate it in their own homes, even if they don't have exactly the stuff from the period. I want people to actually be able to take it away and to have the experience of the period drink too. So I feel like a mix is okay.
As you're shaking, I got a different question. With the bitters, do you prefer the older style bitters? I think it was Booker's you said? Excuse me.
Yeah, Booker's, I haven't really done a side-by-side. I just use them because that's kind of the thing. But it definitely does give it feels like a period experience just because, that's the context you have it in. But it does have kind of a more aromatic, more of a Christmas tree kind of aspect to it that just wasn't fashionable anymore once the 20th century really got rolling. Okay. And the last thing we're going to do, we're just going to peel a little bit of lemon, just keep as much yellow and as little white as possible, and squeeze that over the top. Some people like to leave it in. A lot of people leave it in as a garnish. If I have a choice, what I actually prefer to do with these is to express it over the top and then get rid of it, just because I realize that I like serving things like this to somebody, and you just kind of get the citrus floating on top, greeting your nose without actually seeing where it's coming from. And I just like that as far as an experience goes. And so
And I think when you do that, like you said, it brightens the nose and it like alerts you before you get there, but it leaves you with like a surprise as to where it came from, which is
and if you're lifting it up like slowly, it just kind of greets you. And I like the subtlety of that greeting without actually seeing where it is. Just let all those ingredients really play well together.
Sorry, I wasn't looking at. I didn't look at any of the comments. Sorry, folks. I was just watching Brian do his thing. I got. Sorry about that, everyone. I got to catch up back at that second, but. Whew. That is neat. As for like a beginning.
That's extremely pleasant.
It's a pleasant way to take a distilled spirit. And the old tub, like I was using, I mean, it's not going to change your life, but it's it's nice for a cocktail. But the reason that I really wanted to talk about this was a couple of things, and how much this is the nucleus of a lot of the classic stuff we have today, even though this is existing in the Victorian context and even a pre-Victorian context. This to the Victorians is a cocktail. This has the elements of a spirit, a sweetener, a citrus, and bitters. Now, before personal drinks like this were the most popular thing, people gathered around for a bowl of punch. And that was kind of a communal thing. People sat around for a very long time and they enjoyed this together. That really changed when technology started speeding up transportation. So we get steamships, then we get the railroad, and people aren't sitting around in that convivial nature so much anymore. And the personal drinks get more popular. Now, most of these components were also components of punch. You have the sweetener, you have the spirit, and you have the citrus. And then a lot of times you have other spices and things like that as well. The component that was not part of like the 18th, early 19th century punches is the bitters. And the bitters are what made these seem dangerous in the early 19th century. So the personal drink was just then taking off in the first place. And it didn't necessarily originate with a cocktail. There were other experiments with personal drinks in the late 18th century. But the bitters being introduced into a recreational context, this was medicine. Okay, this was supposed to be a remedy. It wasn't invented or used recreationally. And so when that gets introduced in a recreational sense, you're using medicine for fun. You're using medicine to feel good. And that seemed very dangerous when these first came out. And so that's kind of the difference between punch or a personal glass of punch and a cocktail. But this is what they call a cocktail. And so other mixed beverages aren't necessarily under this umbrella. Like later we're going to do a whiskey daisy. That's not a cocktail. It's just another mixed drink. If you have a sangaree, if you have a julep, all these things are in different categories, even though these days we tend to say we're going out for cocktails. So why that's important, I think. This simple cocktail with these components is the root of so many of the drinks that encompass so much mythology in the classical realm of drinking. And of course, the early 20th century looms large in mixology because of Prohibition, because of classic cocktails, and because when it started coming back after Prohibition, that's what people still remembered. But this root in the Victorian period, I think, would help people understand what's going on with some of this and maybe demystify it a little bit. And a couple of light bulbs that went off in my head about this is when I first started realizing how different this Victorian thing was and really started getting into it. In my younger days, when I was just kind of enjoying classic cocktails and trying to figure it out and all that, I would hear an old-fashioned. And I was like, well, what's more old-fashioned about it than any other drink? But it's like when I started reading this stuff, it's like, oh, yeah, it's an old-fashioned cocktail. That's why it's called that. And I was reminded of that recently when I was hearing a presentation, and the presenter, who was a very good presenter, and she did a great job. This is not to short her at all. There's no way she could have known about this. But she referred to the old fashioned as having originated in 1940 at the Pendennis Club in Louisville. And it's like maybe some truth there, but that doesn't get at the origin of the drink. It's like, what are they doing? They're doing an old fashioned cocktail, right? And there was one case at one point. Amy wanted a Sazerac one night. My brain's like, oh God, I haven't done this in forever. How do I do this? Sadly, so I start opening up my books and stuff. It's like David Wonders is like, oh, it's a whiskey cocktail with these modifications. It's like, right, yeah, it's the same thing. It's all those elements in this cocktail. The Manhattan, which was always my favorite classic cocktail, still is. we don't really think of a whole lot of citrus in a Manhattan today, but if you go back to the original development of it in the 1880s, we just call it Manhattan. They're referring to it as a Manhattan cocktail, and it very much had those specific components. It had the spirit, sweetener, bitters, and then you had a citrus component as well. And of course, with a Manhattan, you've got a balance between whiskey and vermouth. The Victorians tilted way in favor of vermouth. It was often 1-to-1. If y'all saw my show with me and Ben Eves, I did that show on that a while back. And then some of the early Manhattan cocktail recipes from the 1880s, you actually tilt in the direction of more vermouth than whiskey. So you're still dealing with spirit, okay, even though it's more of like a fortified wine or aperitif. But that's you still got those components. If you understand that that's what's playing together, then you understand more how all of these things with all of this mystique works in the classic era. And then you can also work, if you're trying to do like a signature cocktail, if you understand those balances, then you can also use that to kind of work towards your own kind of signature drink. So that's my diatribe right now on the whiskey cocktail.
No, that was fantastic, because that's just what I was saying. There's so many things where you kind of have the bass and it's just the torquing and the playing of it. And that's sometimes a trial and error over time of people just, like what is the right amount. And the 1-to-1 I think might be a bit much for me, but I understand where that goes. So
it was, I was, like I say, I always loved classic Manhattans. And so I was married to the idea of the vermouth being a sweet vermouth. And so I started experimenting with the 1888 Harry Johnson's Manhattan. And so I was doing 50% sweet vermouth and 50% whiskey. I tried a few different whiskeys. I was like, there's just no way this can be good. It was gross. It was heavy and abrasive. And then I did another little show with another mixologist. It was another cocktail completely, but she used dry vermouth where I would have thought a sweet would have been used. And so then I went back and tried the Victorian Manhattan again, and that's when I realized that the key to it is it has to be a dry vermouth if it's going to be at all palatable.
Very cool. And I know, Mike, that's one of your favorite drinks.
Water?
Manhattan.
I know. Yes, Manhattan's way too much. And I like I've gotten to enjoy more of a perfect Manhattan, but then I now have tweaked it and add my secret, which is really no secret. Well, one, I batch them. I'll batch them ahead in a bottle and then put them in the fridge so they're ready to go. But I will do both rye and bourbon, both red and white vermouth. Oh, just nice. A little dash of bitters, and then both Leopold's tart Michigan cherry liqueur and maraschino liqueur.
Oh, nice.
And do that. Oh, baby. They're really good.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah. I enjoy them.
Yeah, that was the other interesting thing in the Victorian period. They really weren't using the cherry wasn't really the garnish. They were just working with the citrus and didn't really have a whole lot of fruit in there, if any. And then absinthe. There was an option to dash absinthe into it as well.
Ooh.
Which found its way into a little bit of everything in the 1880s.
So this is wildly off topic, but saying cherry wasn't necessarily a thing, right? Like the very little I know about old cocktails, like cherry bounce was a thing. So were they like getting away from cherry because they didn't want cherry bounce, or? Oh
no, I just meant that the cherry in the Manhattan wasn't. Okay. That didn't really come into play. But one interesting thing about garnishes at that time is, except for where the citrus is concerned, it's pretty specific about the citrus. But most of the drinks that you had that were garnished with fruit, they called for fruit or berries in season. And so, since even though the railroad is expanding people's access to different fruits and things throughout the year with refrigerated rail cars and faster shipping and stuff like that. In that way, they were still kind of taking the seasons into account, and they just said to garnish it with whatever fruit was on hand at the time.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great.
Wendy Zother said she loves a Sazerac with both rye and cognac, and I gotta say I would be intrigued by that. I haven't played that way, but yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, a nicely made Sazerac. You can't beat it.
Oh, excuse me.
I'm really liking this. I mean, I could see this being well, one, very dangerous in the summertime, but I thought, man, I'd like to try and make this and do it like over a very crushed ice when it's really hot outside.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like sweet tea.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but it kind of is. Well, and the thing is, too, you've got room to play.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. But, you know, bourbon wasn't really a fashionable thing at that point. I mean, we love it now, and we've accentuated it in all these ways, but, you know, bourbon was Kentucky whiskey. It wasn't necessarily the go-to for a fancy cocktail, for a fashionable cocktail. And oftentimes, whiskey could even be seen as a workaround to something nicer. Cognac was really what people preferred in a lot of ways, and then brandy was behind that, and whiskey was kind of a tier below. So it's like we think of our spirits in a different way even than they thought of their spirits.
No.
Emily was wondering, was citrus, was it more like the orange, lemon, or kind of like the lime?
Often lemon pops up the most. Lime does pop up.
So.
And when you're looking at the evolution of punch, which is more of a 17th, 18th century thing, lime was more prevalent in the very early days, like in the 17th century punches. And then in the 18th century, it really rounded the corner into lemons. And lemons especially held on when the individual drinks really started to develop and get popular. So lemons kind of reigned supreme. Oranges would be used for a garnish mostly sometimes. There was a drink called a fix, and you can make it with whiskey, brandy, or gin. And it's even more dangerous going down than this is. And anyway, that's oftentimes would be garnished with an orange and then additional berries, depending on what was in season at the time.
Well, and I'm going to be honest, I'm a berry fan, and I love seeing those notes come up in whiskeys when I'm drinking, or in a cocktail where the cocktail doesn't feel sugared. Right. It just, it feels like just like the fruits are blending in with the drink or are a part of it rather than being like overly sweetened. Yeah. But, even with some of the cherries you're mentioning, Mike, depending upon like the state, some of them can almost feel like they're covered in cough syrup rather than it actually just kind of being like a nice like light coating and the cherry doing all the work.
Well, there's one drink in particular that's especially one of Amy's favorites. It's a Kirschwasser punch from I think that was 1862, but they kept on doing it for a couple of decades. But that's another one that's garnished with berries in season, and for some reason that one in particular is the berries sink to the bottom, and if you're drinking it slowly and it soaks up that Kirschwasser, at the end you have a really nice extra treat. After that's just all kind of mingled together, you got this boozy fruit salad at the bottom.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Shane's out. Yeah, blackberries and bourbon. Yeah, well, I was gonna say blackberries in a lot of drinks. If you're gonna mix that in, is fantastic.
Right. Yeah, we've done strawberries, blueberries. It's really up to you. Nowadays, we're not necessarily dependent on the season, so you can do pretty much whatever you want at any time of the year.
Very, very neat.
Well, I like that so much. I just made another one.
I
quite a bit. The Solomon Scott, which we were talking. Well, we were talking before the show started of trying to be period correct. And since Solomon Scott is really close to the George Washington mash bill, I thought it was a good choice. But the Solomon Scott has a chocolate note to it too, and it's coming across here on the finish.
Now that's one thing we didn't talk about is what whiskeys was everybody else using.
I actually didn't have that one, Mike, so I didn't grab it. So I went with a Runestone rye that's from Minnesota. It's Minnesota rye, but then also 14% malted rye. So I tried that one, but I also have what I'm going to try next was like Mike said, I kind of the first one's going down pretty quick, and it's a show. We can have more than one cocktail.
Oh yeah.
I'm going with the Great Northern rye that we had that was double barreled and toasted. Just because when you were mentioning like the chocolate one and stuff like that, I was like, oh, I had this right at hand. And this is just, I thought it might be pushing an edge to kind of go, a little bit too much play in the barrel, but now I don't feel bad at all.
Nice.
I did. I just grabbed Jim Beam Repeal Batch because I was like, oh man, I have absolutely no idea what to grab. And it was like, okay, that's supposed to taste kind of.
That's actually a pretty decent bourbon though. And
Oh,
and what's made it even better for me is it came out and then nobody bought it. And so the grocery store down the street was clearancing it out for under $10. And I bought like 6 bottles of it.
Yeah.
I think I saw it clearanced out for like 14. So yeah,
Oh my
not
God.
quite a few.
It's great. I mean, it's really good for that. An Old Tub, I mean, people weren't buying it at 20 or 25 bucks. And so it went down to like 15 or 12. It's pretty decent. I mean, it's a bottled and bond bourbon and there's nothing wrong with it.
No, there's not. I like it. Like I say, we could talk another time about, you know, how close we may or may not be getting to that period. But it's solid. It's full bodied. The story is fun. And honestly, you know, let's face it, if I see a good story on a label, a lot of times I'm probably going to fall for it. So,
I mean, sometimes just a good bottle will get me at points. Like I've learned that sometimes you have to hold back Lusty Claw, but it's you know, sometimes a bottle or a good story on it is well. I'm like, okay, I'm in.
Yep.
You know,
yep.
I'll see what happens.
I'll give you that.
I've eaten plenty of bad steaks.
Well, and this gets at something too, a little bit that I think is an interesting topic about when people talk about whiskey and spirits in general in the 19th century and prior. People like. I found that a lot of people go one of two ways when they're looking at the past. They're like, oh, it was very terrible, or oh, it was very great. And of course, it was life. And so experiences will vary. But, you know, at that point, especially when you're in the pre-industrial part, and even the early industrial part of distilled spirits, I think that you're looking at a trade, you know, and certain people are better at trades than other people are. Certain people have objectives with their trades, and certain people have other objectives. And so certain people had the skill, they had the pride, and certain people were cranking out bad stuff. And so you had good and bad. I suspect if we leapt back to the middle of the 19th century and we found people who were actually invested in the trade, we would have some very, very good things. But there was also rock cut out there. And so I think a lot of times people overstate how bad it was, and they were preparing it this way to cover up how bad it was. I think that's a very overstated. That's overstating the case. We got to where we are now for a reason, and I think if anything, we've lost craftsmanship. Even though it might have been a little bit easier for some bad stuff to filter in, especially in the days when barrels were being shipped by railway rather than being bottled. And it was easy enough to pop that bung out and take some out and put something else in. So those things did happen. But I always think that it's overstating the point to say that they mixed it because it was all bad and they had to cover it up.
I wonder how much of it was just like they mixed it because sugar makes everything taste better.
Exactly. Yeah. And this all, like I say, this goes back to punch. You know, an early version of mixed drinks in the 18th century was the sling, where it was pretty much just sugar, some water, and the spirit. So that's been known for a very, very long time. It's not always a good idea to just, you know, quaff spirits straight if you're, you know, going to be sipping for a while. I think there was one case where it was one of the early explorers, one of his men, and this was very early on in the distilled spirits game. One of his men just went buck wild on some island and got arrested, and he had to go collect him. I'm forgetting which one it was. But he showed the game, and it's like, oh, yeah, he didn't mix his liquor with anything. That's what happened.
Well, I also wonder especially with some of the cocktails and some of the sweeter cocktails, if it wasn't, because, you know, there was no air conditioning, there was no refreshment. So you want something cool, refreshing, and alcoholic. And
yeah.
And I thought about that because I was thinking about these recipes this weekend, which is we lost our air conditioning. And I was like, it's really hot and I want something to drink. I don't want whiskey. So I switched to gin and tonics Friday night, and they were great. Yeah. But I found myself still wanting a whiskey, and I was like, do I want to have one over crushed ice, or do I want to go ahead and make one of these cocktails and see how they are? Because it was hot and I wanted something refreshing and I wanted to relax.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And that was the same back then. And that's the thing, that surprised a lot of people about the 19th century too, is in a lot of places you could actually get ice all year round. And that especially is true the further into the century you go. They were experimenting with refrigerated rail cars in the 1840s. So that's very early. And of course, way before that, you had the techniques of building ice houses where you dig down to a certain level where the temperature is constant, kind of like a cave, and you keep it packed in sawdust and straw and all that. You can, if it's managed correctly, you can have ice all year round. After the Civil War, you've got people shipping ice by rail car. So yeah, it was everywhere. And even if you didn't have it at home, a saloon that did have it and could make you a nice, cool drink was a pretty enticing thing, especially in those hotter months.
All right.
Yeah, I switched over to the other one, like I said, the other whiskey, and
Oh, the other whiskey, not the other cocktail. Okay.
I fell behind there for a second.
Oh no, I'm gonna let you lead the way, but whew. This, the dark, like you were saying, the chocolate notes. This has like a caramel, chocolate, cherry note that comes through more on this. Like you said, this just very simple, but like you said, sometimes just being able to do your craft well.
Yeah.
And do what you're doing makes a huge difference. Because I'm not saying I'm even very good at making a cocktail, but having one made for you that's made by the right person, you understand the difference. And that's when when I was trying to explain to someone else when they were saying, does it make a difference with shaken or stirred or how you do things? I'm like, actually, yeah, it does, because different things happen.
Yeah.
Like chemically, it's like say foaming or frothing at different points, and then like it does change the taste or flavor or aroma of what's going on. So once again, someone spent the time to figure out how to do what it was, or found it by accident. Whoever, I'll take however it gets here. I always think those things are kind of miracles when someone comes up with something.
Well, that I found was especially true with the early Manhattans and martinis, the ones in the 1880s. Is that, of course, a classic martini, I'd shake the crap out of it. I'm shaking it until my hand practically freezes to that shaker. But with a 19th century martini, if you don't stir it, you're going to brutalize it. You're just going to lose the whole thing, because there's a lot more going on there in a 19th century martini than there is in a classic martini. One being the Old Tom gin itself. And so that has it's hard to even articulate all the differences between Old Tom gin and the London Dry gin. It just has a whole different character. It has a roundness, it has a wetness to it. The aroma is different, and then there's other ingredients than ones in the 19th century martinis, like Grand Marnier, and there was citrus involved and things like that. And so those, if you don't stir it, you're just going to brutalize it. And I didn't appreciate that until I started doing the Victorian side.
That's interesting.
So I got to tell you, the thing I was trying to think of what this reminds me of drinking this, because with the chilled cocktail, and then it has there's a little bit of alcohol, and I mean not a lot, because there's a lot of sweetness to it, but then there just seems to be like this candy that runs through. And what this reminds me of is if you've ever had ice cream where they either for a topping or for a mix-in, they use a melted candy bar. And if you haven't ever had that, you need to do that.
Gotcha.
So, but that's what, because it's like, oh, okay, it's nice and refreshing. And you're like, oh, sugar rush. And then it's like, okay, now we're back to refreshing it. Oh, sugar rush. And it's really, really nice. This is, I'm enjoying this one way too much. I'm not going to.
Well, I think too, it reflects, talk about changing tastes. It reflects the way Victorians like to eat as well. Victorians, it was heavy, rich, often sweet food. And so the cocktails come across just like their food does. They had quite a sweet tooth. And so that really plays into it. Their food was very heavy. They ate a lot of it when they could afford to, and things like that. And so when we really started to experience the different character of Victorian cocktails as opposed to classic cocktails, that's one of the first things that occurred to us, because we'd already done a lot of experimenting with Victorian food. And so, classic cocktails, you can drink them all night, and you're not going to get full. It was the martini especially that hit me, that after I drank one, I felt full. It's heavy, it's round, it's sweet. And so it's like the changes in trends with drinks also change. They reflect the changes in trends with food as well.
Have you guys ever? Because I know you do period things. Have you guys ever done like a whiskey pairing or whiskey dinner night? Or not whiskey, but like a period or like a cocktail thing, like you're saying, like how it can change. Like, if you have it, I'm almost intrigued as to like starting the period, like appetizer changing and changing, like going like each period as you go and having it like change and seeing how it happens. I don't know. Like I said, you got me all wound up.
Yeah, we haven't had a chance to do that, and I like that idea. It's occurred to me before to try to do in-person events where we're actually pairing Victorian food with it as well. The challenge is basically we're always working with a partner, and so it's what they have the capacity to do. But I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind that I would like to merge those two worlds. It's just as far as doing a public event, it's just a matter of finding the right partner who wants to work together on it and understand that and put the work into it. No, but that's an excellent idea.
I just meant when you were talking about like, kind of how the cocktail changes. That could be a whole evening in itself.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing we've done. We've done some really neat in-person events with the Victorian Barroom, and we've got several scheduled later on this year. And it always gets to the point where, because we don't do the food, we just do the drinks. And so I think a lot of times the host gets a little overwhelmed with the whole idea, and so they just do kind of like regular charcuterie. But to have that lead time and have those resources to actually put the right food in front of people would be a really, really magical thing.
It's like a Christmas event. Sorry, yeah. I'm planning something when we come.
Well, there's some people. There's some people here in LaGrange. Some good friends of ours. They own an event venue, and I always thought that would probably be where we did it. But weddings are a lot of work, and so they're selling venue.
Yeah, weddings are a ton of work. We were talking to other people who own distilleries recently, and it was like, that's the one thing I'll do events, but just don't leave that out. Leave weddings out of the whole thing.
Even when I was the program director at Locust Grove, which was really part of the spark to this whole thing. It's also where I met Alan. We did the small farm distillery, but that job, I loved the place. The job about killed me. Doing special events and all that. But one thing I didn't have to deal with was weddings. And I always thought that looked even worse.
It's just one of those things where there's people people already have high expectations, but that day is like just up there. Right. And the slightest thing can just send people off. It's like, nope,
it's one day of your life.
Yeah.
I always wanted to ask people a lot of times, like, you realize there's a tomorrow, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, this isn't the whole thing.
Yeah.
This is just the first step.
Right.
So,
well, do we want to mix up a Whiskey Daisy?
I think so. Let me put that up here for a second so people can kind of see where we're headed. At least get a couple things ready like we mentioned beforehand.
I'm going to do it just a little bit different than it says up there just because I was looking at the sources again today, and I think I can simplify it a little bit. This one is more involved, and it's a little strange, but if it gets done right, it's really magical. So first thing we're going to start off with, and I'm just going to go ahead and put this in the shaker in the first place. But I've got that. We're going to do a goblet. This is from 1888, the recipe is, and this goblet is from the 1880s. It's got a nice little bird motif on it. So we're going to do a half tablespoon of sugar. Oh, also, Harry Johnson, who wrote this recipe, puts a note in. This drink is very palatable and almost anyone will like it.
Nice.
There's a half tablespoon of sugar. We're going to do a couple of dashes of lemon juice. This is a different order than I usually do things in. We're just going to do a dash of lime juice. And it says a splash of seltzer. I've done side-by-side comparisons. You can do seltzer or club soda. They'll both be great. I'm just using my little bottle from the grocery. And so a squirt, a splash, it's up to you. You want to get enough in there to try to dissolve the sugar. And the tricky thing here is, I find, is try to get it largely dissolved without killing all the bubbles. And so I was kind of surprised they did it in this order, but that's what the source says. And so that's probably not perfect. It's certainly not as much as I would usually do, but we're just going to try to keep it mixing around and not leave any at the bottom. We're going to put a little bit of ice in there now. And it says shaved ice. I don't have any shaved ice this morning, but I know what the end goal is, and so I'm confident I can use cubes. And we're going to just chill that a little bit gently. Okay. Now comes our whiskey. It is up to you what whiskey you want to do. This is a very sweet drink. There's a lot going on in it. And so when possible, I like to use a bold rye in this so that that spiciness kind of shines through everything else and you get a nice balance there. And so what I'm using tonight is Dad's Hat, cask strength. And so with a regular proof whiskey, like something like, 80, 90, 100, you're going to do 2 ounces. I'm going to back this off to 1.5 ounces because it's pretty strong. This whiskey in particular, there was at one point, Alan and me and Steve Bayshore were doing a show with Locust Grove called the Punch Bowl, and Old Overton was on there as well. And they're trying to revive some old Pennsylvania rye whiskey. And I really haven't waded into 19th century rye on the show just because it seems like such a minefield. But I asked their guy on the show, it's like, hey, what can I get right now that's going to get me somewhere close to the experience? And he recommended Dad's Hat, cask strength. And so I've used this to experiment with a number of Victorian drinks. And then our yellow chartreuse. This is the milder version that you'll get these days. This originated in the Victorian period. And you're going to do half a pony of that. That's half an ounce. If you're at home without special measuring stuff, that is just a tablespoon. We're going to put that on top. And we're going to put more ice on top of that. And stir that till it's nice and chilled. Again, I try not to be too aggressive with this because if I can preserve some of that fizz, I like to. That's already getting nice and cold. I'm going to try not to leave too much time between stopping, moving, and straining just so that sugar stays agitated in there because it's not perfectly dissolved. And this is one of those, like we talked about, you can garnish with berries in season. We had no berries, so we're just going to drink it as it is.
That's very cool. I'm not done with mine, but I'm just like I was saying, the patience of what you were, how to do. You're laughing at me, Mike, but I mean, even when you go to a bar, everything's about speed.
No, it's not that. It's like for me, with cocktails, like this one, I'm like, okay, this sounds really great, but if I'm craving one, be like, hurry up.
Honestly, that's why most evenings, I mean, we like to have a little nightcap. Most evenings we get down to it and we like some bourbon, ice, and soda. It's like, well, as much as we like to play with cocktails, it's like, well, at the end of the workday or something, it's like, just don't have it in us. But with something like this, this one's one I had to play with more than a lot of them, but it's all about understanding what the end goal is and what needs to go down, what has to go on with all the ingredients, what the end product's supposed to be, and how you're going to get it all there. And so I think once you get into it, once you think about that and you do some trial and error, like you were saying earlier, then you'll get there. And the whole point of the show that we want to do is we want people to be able to go back and to do this at home. We want to give people the resources to actually have this experience themselves. We don't just want to look like magic. We want people to actually experience this flavor of the period.
So I got to tell you, I was kind of surprised when I looked up, and even though my ingredients are slightly different than yours, specifically I use Grand Marnier because I don't have chartreuse. got pretty close to the same color.
Yeah.
Yeah. From what
Yeah. Nice color.
Which means nothing, but I was just like, hey, I didn't totally screw it up. But this is tasty.
Yeah. You like it?
Oh yeah.
Well, it's a shame about the chartreuse. I didn't realize it was getting so scarce. We've had this bottle hanging around for a while, but I absolutely love chartreuse. And the character it gives to the drink is just so amazing. And I love the story of chartreuse. I mean, the green came about in 1840 is actually a toned down version of the medicinal stuff that the monks had been making prior to that, even though we think of the green chartreuse as a pretty bold, strong spirit. But that's something that we love to just put with ice and some soda water, like cut it with that and sip on it. And then the yellow I don't like to sip on as much, but it really gives a nice character to the Victorian drinks.
Now, I did end up, because when you were describing why you chose the rye that you chose, I switched and I went to the more aggressive rye.
Okay.
I went to this Tattersall single barrel, which is really good. And it is along the lines of the Dad's Hat that I've had, where it's it's great. I mean, it's just rye. It's just really good.
I will say too, this is the first time I've actually tried the Dad's Hat in this, even though I was confident the theory was sound. This is the best one of these I've ever done.
Yeah.
Like I say, that boldness, it shines through, but none of the aggressiveness of it shines through. It just plays well with all the other ingredients.
Yeah, because this is, I'm assuming the Dad's Hat is around 60 or above 60, because this is 64.6.
Yeah, this is 61.8.
Yeah, there's zero alcohol on this for the flavor, which that's really bad.
Yes.
But for
that's
flavor,
what you're going for.
It's really packing a lot of flavor.
No, it's very, very flavorful.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's the neat thing about this. I'm like, for as crazy and fancy as everyone tries to get in today's world, this is fantastic.
Yeah,
for what it is. And like you said, if you had a little bit of berries, or I had a blackberry or something to throw on the top or around the inside right now, that's just one more extra layer of complexity.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, just getting everyone at the baby shower completely shit-faced on your cocktail.
You can do that. These people, they knew what they were doing, and most of the time when I'm dealing with a period source, a couple of things is we grew up, I think, in the 20th century with the idea that all you got to do is read the instructions and you can do it. Everything's just a set of instructions. And that's not the way it is when you're dealing with a historic trade, a historic craft, or something like that. It takes practice. It takes failing. It takes learning from your mistakes. And 99 times out of 100, whether I'm dealing with mixed drinks from the 19th century, cookbooks from the 19th century, tailoring manuals from the 19th century, when something goes wrong and I go back and look at it again, I had discarded something from the advice they were given, and so I go back and I reincorporate that. And it's something you just gotta, it's the journey is part of it. It's, the refining it is a part of the process.
Back in here on this one again.
So I don't know what yellow chartreuse tastes like, but I Googled appropriate replacements and it came up with like a list of 7. I had 3 of them, so I mixed them all together.
Okay.
What were they?
It was Amaro, Absinthe, and Jägermeister.
Interesting.
So,
well, I guess the herbal. Okay. I'm just to get. I like to see where AI takes people.
this was not AI, but it was. This is very licoricey.
Well, I'm not going to call chartreuse a cousin of absinthe in case Alan is listening.
He's here.
But they are both very heavily botanically infused spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very wildly different quality. One doesn't eliminate the Jaeger.
I'll take that one out.
I agree with that just in life, but when the internet tells you something, you believe it.
Wow. It's just very aromatic. Just the
Mhm.
way it
It
is.
is.
Just off of what's in there. It has such a really nice punch.
I've done this with a few different ones, and I think I like this one the best.
Mm.
You know,
Maybe
where the
because-
first one to me is like, you could have it any time. It's really hot out. You just want to have a simple cocktail, whatever. It's like every day. This almost has a purpose, like after dinner, you know, or even like before you start everything to kind of get the flavors kick started.
Yeah.
It's and not that the other one was not flavorful. This is just it's a different type of flavorful.
Well, and this evolved at a very different time than the whiskey cocktail evolved. That one was evolving during the era of punch, and so it was a different time. They were thinking of it in a different way. This is a Gilded Age beverage. Okay, so this is 1888. We are into the Gilded Age. There's an elegance. There's a refinement that's going on. There's more people that are able to experience that due to the way that transportation had changed, due to the way manufacturing had changed, the possibilities of upward mobility, stuff like that. And so the whole dynamic of the world had changed by the time this drink came around, as opposed to when the basic, very good, but very basic whiskey cocktail had happened. And the interesting thing about the book that this comes from, this was from Harry Johnson's manual of 1888. Harry Johnson had several versions of his manual, and the next closest one that I found was from 1882. And so you got this 1882 source and this 1888 source from the same author. The 1882 one was not exactly like Jerry Thomas, which was from 20 years earlier, but it was very similar. So the recipes, it's the same titles, it's very similar recipes and things like that. And you're not seeing the familiar classic cocktail names like Martini and Manhattan and things like that. That's 1882. You get 6 years down the road in 1888, and this pops up. The Manhattan pops up. The Martini pops up. All these familiar words. So we're starting to round the corner into that classic era of mixology, even though we have a foot solidly planted in the Victorian period. So this does not taste like a classic cocktail. You know, this tastes like a Victorian cocktail. His Manhattan tasted like a Victorian cocktail. His Martini tasted like a Victorian cocktail. But when you're used to one and you taste the other, you can see where it's going. You can see how those elements are evolving toward what became so iconic in the 20th century, and then got attached to Prohibition and got attached to classic Hollywood, which is how we really still think of the elegance of cocktails to this day.
And I think that I like I don't want to say it's more booze forward, but it's more the star of the show than what today's version of a kind of a sugary, fruity cocktail imbibe. It's more alcohol forward, and I think that's why I like it. You're getting the other flavors, but I always, and sounds weird, but I like to know I'm tasting. I like to know I'm drinking something a little.
Yeah,
bit.
I'm the same way.
I don't like it completely hidden. That's
Right.
that's when I get nervous. Where I'm like, I don't taste anything, and I know it's boozy and not super sugary, or something. Like, okay, now it's a problem. This kind of looms on that edge.
Well, I think accenting it with the chartreuse or whatever those other spirits that you're using, I think that adds to that. And especially when you've got the yellow chartreuse to use, it both tones it down while also expressing that boozy quality. It's very much an alcohol, but it's a syrupy sweet alcohol. There's texture to it. And I think in a way that kind of tones down the very potent rye, but it also accents it, and it doesn't hide the fact that you're actually drinking an alcoholic beverage.
That's neat. So this is I'll get myself into trouble, but no.
Yeah, it's going down a little fast.
Well, hey, it's a little early, or it's a little late. I mean, I think you're in East Coast time, aren't you? Like,
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair. We've got you on late. Yeah. See, that's what I mean. So I'll sip this one down pretty quick.
Yeah. I'm not going to have a problem going to sleep tonight. I can tell you that.
So
This after two of the first one, and this one's already really starting to kick in. This
I'm
is
feeling the same way.
yeah, it packs a little wallop.
Well, and that's what, like you were saying, is when most of you are having like a drink at that point. Okay, so this is like I don't know the background enough, but thinking where you're going from brandies or some other things like that for like after dinner drinks or something like that, where I feel like this, like you said, becoming a cocktail, becoming an evolution or a mixed drinker rather than just pouring out one thing. It's neat to, I don't know. Like you said, I need to do a little more research. Where do you do your research? Where do you find some of these old manuals and stuff? Like how deep do you dig to find some of this information?
I just search for, and I've not searched in a while because I accumulated like a body of information that I've been kind of going through. But the big thing is for me, it's like I'm looking for the primary source documentation. And so I'm looking for the things that people actually wrote in the period. And so sometimes I find that in the form of reprinted manuals. You can actually find the physical books. Other times I can fish around and I can find where people have uploaded like images of the books and all that. And so they've scanned in the pages. And so I'm not somebody who really relates to the computer. And so when I find those, I print them out. And I put them in a binder, and then I'll go back to those in perpetuity. Like tonight with the Whiskey Daisy, the way I do this is I keep, for my purposes, I keep note cards. And so I go to the period source, I do the experiments, I write my findings down on note cards, and then I keep notes on those to kind of keep up with what I've figured out over time. And then like tonight, I was looking at my notes on the Whiskey Daisy because I'm not really a bartender. I don't get to do this every day, so I do have to go back to my notes. But I was looking at it, it's like, I'm going to go back to the source on that. And so I did. And it's like I started rethinking some of the ways that I was going to do that. And so that's the big thing, is going for the primary source material, actually find what people wrote down during the period. Jerry Thomas was the first one to write down the bartender's trade in 1862. Prior to that, it had just been passed from bartender to bartender, and it still continued to be. It still kind of is. That's not the first time anybody wrote down a drink recipe. That had happened many times over the ages, but he was the first one to write a manual. And then it started to increase in frequency from there, and then it's really snowballing by the late 19th and early 20th century. And so you got to find that stuff. The challenge is then, of course, the terminology. The challenge is to come and to actually understand the terminology. What are they talking about? You can't assume that their term means what our term means. Okay. And so early on in my exploration of Victorian cocktails, I assumed a lot of things and made a lot of mistakes. They were fun mistakes, because we were still having drinks. But I hadn't figured out some of the terminology, and so then you can start to do some secondary research. Always a good idea to check those people. Whenever you do secondary source research, like David Wondrich, a gift to anybody trying to figure out anything alcohol-wise from the 19th century. I don't want to sound arrogant and say that I don't necessarily agree with him all the time, but I'll look at his position. I'll look at his sources. It's always important to. Oh, Amy needs some Daisy. Amy, in the other room. Oh, I thought she was asking for a drink. Well, okay. So terminology. They say a wine glass in a Victorian manual as a measurement. Okay. Mm-hmm. We think of a wine glass as kind of a globe kind of thing that kind of curves in towards the top. A wine glass to them was this.
Very cool.
Okay. And so I had already, when I started looking at this stuff, I had already kind of taken an interest in Victorian glassware. And so I happened to have a bunch of Victorian wine glasses sitting around. And so I lined them up and I measured out how many each one held, how much each one held. And on average, they were about 2 ounces. Later on, I was looking in David Wondrich's book. I realized he had a conversion chart. Look, he said 2 ounces. And so now on my measure here, I can use 2 ounces. That's a wine glass. For them, that's this. That changed a little bit over time. They decreased in size a little bit, but in general, if you're talking about a Victorian wine glass, you're talking about 2 ounces. If you're talking about a pony, you're talking about 1 ounce. If you're talking about Curacao, you're not talking about the run-of-the-mill Curacao that you can get in the store today. That's a 20th century invention. You're talking about something more along the lines of Grand Marnier. And so when Mike substituted Grand Marnier in this drink, I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what a Victorian would have done. Things of that nature. Gin, again, London dry gin. That's what we usually use in a martini these days. It's not that it didn't exist. It just didn't become dominant until well into the 1890s. And by that point, you are almost over with the Victorian period. Even in the 1890s, they're still specifying Old Tom gins as the gin that you're supposed to use. And so that's the thing. It's like you take the primary sources, you dig into it, you try to figure it out. You can take some secondary sources so long as you're not just taking information where somebody is saying, well, I feel like this is what it must have been. No, it's like you got to vet their sources. You got to see how that is. And then if possible, go back and view those sources yourself. And so I find that enjoyable. That's kind of what I do for fun. That's how I get at it. I try to find the original texts. And then if I'm stuck on something, if I want to double check something, then I try to go in and check with somebody else's research and then flesh it out. It's always an evolving concept whenever you're doing research like this. I always say that when you're doing historical research, the most exciting thing is to find out, to discover that you were wrong. Because if you discover you were wrong, you get to get that much closer to the truth.
Well, and it like spurs you further too.
Right.
It's like, oh, yeah. Son of a bitch. When you mentioned like different measures and stuff, when you were doing a dash before, my family when I was younger was always like, bitters, or if you're doing Worcestershire and say a Bloody Mary was a dash, which is just a quick little pop rather than like a little pop and pour, like that. I'm like, and that matters as to what you're putting in, like 3 to 5. And I think period wise also that might matter, just as like you said, it's just terminology of the time.
Yeah. Well, and dashes especially are very subjective in this period. So I kind of even try to just kind of keep in mind what the ingredient is I'm using and what I'm trying to get across with it. And so I forget which drink it is now, but there's one I do that it says a dash of yellow chartreuse. And I love the taste of chartreuse. So when I'm doing a dash of that, I angle that bottle so I get a real healthy dash of it in there.
So I have a question. So if someone was going to try, let's say, watching your channel and they wanted to do something that you're making on there, if someone was going to go out and find that glassware, is lead prevalent in the glass, or is there things people should look out for if they go to try to find some of that old glassware or any other bar accessories?
You're not looking at any health issues with the glassware. The lead had long since faded out of it. And especially when you get into this period, like the later period, when you're talking about press glass, you're not talking about lead in there at all. That is a mass-produced process that they were doing there in the mid to late 19th century. And so the big thing with that and the fun thing about it is getting to know the patterns and getting to know the feel of the glass. And I had a mentor in all of this when I got involved, and it's like she kept on telling me, it's like, you just got to get your hands on it. You just got to get your hands on it. And so I would get some things on eBay that, they said it was the right thing. And so I would get it and I would take it to her and she was like, this is good. That's nothing. That's okay. And so from there, she had been doing all this. And so then you literally start to develop a feel for what it feels like in your hand. You start to get a feel for what the glass looks like, what the base looks like, things like that. You start to know when it's too good to be true. Not that it couldn't be. There were some cases in the 20th century where these were reissued. And in some cases, maybe even the same molding plates were still around. And so it's kind of a journey like that. It does help to have a mentor who can kind of get you started. But it's really just a process of jumping in, doing some research, Don't take people at their word. Sometimes even when you're looking on eBay, once you get a feel for it, you can tell what feels right even without having to put your hands on it. But then there's been times I've got it in the mail and it's like that just doesn't feel right. That does not feel like the other glass I've had from that period. And so then, you put that in the reenacting stash. You can take that out to a camp or something. It's not a tragedy if it breaks. So my whole thing is a lot of times this stuff is not expensive if you know what to look for. And so I just try not to pay much more than I'd be sorry to have gone out on a lark and failed at. Is my whole thing, unless it's something that I've really keyed in on and I really like. Bartending equipment is next to inaccessible now as far as old stuff. That wasn't true 20 years ago, but people have latched on to this whole thing. And so the price of any kind of bar equipment, up to and including a common nutmeg grater, has gone through the roof. So at that point, unless you've got a lot of money, you're probably just not going to find it. And your best bet is to dig around for some equivalents. Like I think we said earlier today, I can't remember whether the show was on or not, but the form of a lot of cocktail gear has not changed much since the end of the 19th century. So if you look at old like cocktail mixology gear, catalogs, guides, and things like that, the form is the same on into not much different. And so no, they didn't have stainless steel. But a lot of the common stuff you get to this day is really pretty similar to what they were using. But if glassware is something you're into, I've had a ton of fun with it. And I keep on having to pack some up and put it in the basement because I just keep on doing it. I can't resist. But we've had a lot of fun like that with that. It's out there. And there's some of it's not considered valuable. And so you can get it for next to nothing.
So have you ever thought like some people will do, etched Glencairns? Have you thought about doing Victorian barroom glassware?
We've started, and I didn't launch it very well. We've got tumblers and we've got some coupes. The quantities are waning. I wound up using them mostly as gifts to people who were supporting us and things like that. We would show up, they'd be hosting us someplace, and I'd give them a couple. But we've done some of that through like some of the common distillery ware supply places, and I just haven't gotten the website up and running where we can sell it. I've started probing how to actually reproduce real Victorian glassware, but that is a more difficult question than you would think. I thought it's like this stuff was pressed, it was mass produced in the first place. This is not a blown glass. I thought this would be easy enough, but I've hit a lot of roadblocks. So I'm trying to figure out how to recreate that. But I would love to take some of the pieces that I especially enjoy, have them recreated and make them available for other people to use their own mixology. And I would definitely have our logo put into the base just because I don't like people trying to pass off counterfeit.
Right.
That's true. No, but that's neat. That's a good way to think of that, Mike, because it does matter, and just kind of some of the cut designs on some of them just make you feel different. And I'm just on one of the drinks, Mike. I'm using the old Pro one.
Well, but that's one of the reasons that I was asking, because as I'm not a small person. Mitch can relate to this. So you like a substantial glass in your hand. However, if you are trying to get, and there seems to be more of a movement of people trying to be, whether it's real or not, they're trying to be authentic and they're trying to get back to certain things. So if they had, instead of these big freaking basketball sized wine goblets, it's like, no, here's a real Victorian sized one. I could see people really wanting to do that as a fun thing. Is like, oh, we're having a Victorian cocktail party, or maybe not Victorian, but a traditional one, to where you're not putting a half a bottle of wine in a glass,
right?
Because it's ridiculous for one thing, but something a little more traditional.
Well, one thing that Amy may have found too, because I started collecting these glasses, and we'd had modern wine glasses before, and we were having dinner one night. I don't even think it was a special dinner or anything, but we decided we were going to put the little traditional glasses on the table. And you can refill as often as you want.
Yeah.
It's the thing. And so it's like we were halfway through the dinner, and I was like, is this weird or is this fun? And Amy was like, I think this is fun. So we actually really enjoyed that. It was just a different way of relating to wine.
Yeah.
The other thing to consider in that period was the sort of dining that they were doing in that period, in the early part of the Victorian period. It was called dinner à la Française, and it was not like the stereotypical fancy aristocratic dinner that we think of now, where servants are hovering over you constantly, and there is a constant pairing, and somebody else chooses what you have. In general, in that dining style, in the early part of the period, a lot of dishes would be laid out on the table at one time. And so those would be passed around, things like that. And any kind of wine that you wanted was supposed to be available to you. And so you got to choose what kind of wine you had, and you got to have as much as you wanted, especially if you were a man. And so those glasses could literally be refilled as often as you wanted with whatever kind you wanted. And so I think the Victorian period was so long, I think people have trouble relating to how much change there was over time. It was the end of the period where you get these very stiff formal dinners and all that, with the specific pairings and the frequent removes and the servants hovering over you and all that, much more leisurely at the beginning of the period. And then, of course, the ladies removed to the drawing room for coffee and things like that, and men would sit around the table for a very long time with port and spirits. It was only at the end of the period that part of the dinner got abbreviated, and the men would remove from the table and have coffee too.
Very cool.
So just because you have a small wine glass doesn't mean you can't drink a lot out of it.
Hey,
Well,
that's
but-
I think
but
Ben
it's more
Franklin used to
social.
hammer some. I'm just being honest.
No, it's more social because you go back to the table where the spirits are, or where the wine is at, or you go back to the bartender who's pouring, and
Right.
you chat and talk, or instead of just, here, I'm going to pour this, half gallon into my glass, and wear my "It's Wine O'Clock" T-shirt and walk around, and have all this stuff. It's ridiculous,
Yeah.
Just it'd be like walking around with with one of those glasses full of whiskey. It's really stupid. It's pretty stupid.
No, yeah, there was a sociability to it. There was an elegance to it. And like I say, it's not that they were lightweights, but it's a different way of approaching it. And there is a refinement to it.
So you say that,
It's enjoyable.
but my girlfriend has a wine glass that holds an entire bottle of wine. And for movie nights, this is the best thing ever, because we don't have to pause the movie every.
Okay, well, but you know what? And this is not me backtracking in any way. That glass has a purpose. Now, that's not a glass that she's going to take to a 5-year-old birthday party or something like that. It is, or maybe she will, and if she does, more power to you, Morgan.
5-year-old, I think.
But it's like for something like that, like movie night, totally makes sense. 100% makes sense.
Yes, she responded.
Yeah.
Or drinks, because it does. You either have to pass the drinks around or go back to the communal setting or anything like that.
We've had people for dinner here at our place, and we'll put the small wine glasses out and then the larger water goblets, and I've got a couple of claret jugs from the 1890s, and we'll just fill one with red, one with white, and they get passed around the table as often as they need to be. And it's kind of a pleasant ritual to have that interaction and that thought throughout dinner, I think.
Mm-hmm. I've always liked that. Well, I was gonna think about the way, like you said, the giant wine glass, but there's other things too, like with beer, where it used to have 8 or 12 ounce beers, and now you can get the 32 or 64 ounce tub like you used to see on The Simpsons. It is available now.
Well, and beer was often consumed in a different way. 20 ounce pint. I mean, it's like packaging a beer in a 12 ounce can. That doesn't seem like a single portion of beer. That's some beer. It's not a beer. But you used to take a bucket to the pub to get filled up with beer. And they had to start regulating that because people had different sized buckets.
It's like 7-Eleven day.
Right.
My
Beer was dispensed from a keg. Whiskey was dispensed from a keg. And so it was your container that went and got it. And there's reminiscences from children who, I guess, were growing up in the late 19th, early 20th century of literally taking their dad's bucket to the pub to get filled up for him from the barrel and taking it back home. That's just how beer was consumed and transported.
I think my aunt told the story. It was either her or her aunt who would take a bucket to the bar and get it filled up.
Yeah.
And their parents stopped letting them do it because on the way home, they would slurp all the foam off the top. As like 8-year-olds and just be like, "Ooh, this is the best."
But yeah, especially like working class Irish German neighborhoods, stuff like that. Yeah.
Pretty standard.
Yeah. Our last name would have been either Weddle or Hennessy. So, yeah, that really tracks.
Yeah, beer is a different story.
That's awesome. But I just realized what time it is and how we've stumbled over an hour.
Stumbled.
Well, I don't know.
That was at the beginning of the episode for me.
Only 25% of us have. No.
Maybe that's because you haven't gotten off the chair yet. I'm going back. I'm going between the two drinks at this point, and I'm just.
Oh, I'm out of the first one, and I'm not going to make a third.
Oh, fine. Sorry. Normally I tease you, but I'm not going to now. But Brian, thank you for coming on and introducing us to these two really wonderful cocktails. And like you said, you can see how this just the base of this one could easily lean into different realms. It was kind of like the mini base or the father of some of these other cocktails.
It's the building blocks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on. It's always a blast to talk to you guys. We love watching the show. It's even more fun to be on the show. So I've been looking forward to this for a while. I thought the show started at 8 tonight. I was like all ready to go at 8. Amy comes in like, no, you got an hour.
I'm sorry, man.
Oh, no. That was me. I was ready.
No, but if you haven't, stop over and subscribe to his channels because he does a far better job than we do with what they're doing. I'm sorry. I'm just going to be honest.
He's way better than us.
He's way better than us.
Say that.
He cares.
Just different kind of production.
Yeah, he cares.
Is his nickname going to be NBC? Whichever one cares. PBS.
Oh, we love what you guys do.
No, but it's definitely stop out, and what you're doing is always of high quality. You guys put in effort, you put in time, you care about what you're doing, and you can tell by what you're putting out, and that's why I think the absinthe thing is going to be. People always in the last like 5 to 10 years, people always like to dip a toe into absinthe, and then so they've dipped a toe and they're like, oh. That's good. Now I've said I've done it, and then they kind of walk away after like the first month or so of it. And I don't know. I think there needs to be a deeper look, a deeper look at it, especially with how I don't want to say fancy, but how mainstream it's starting to come back. Yeah. And I'd like to see people have a better knowledge of it rather than just the toe dipping that happens so frequently now.
This film is going to be deep in the weeds. I was looking back at the footage this past weekend because I was getting the last syncs of audio and video together, and we go through a lot in this. And again, this is research that Alan did that he first told me about in 2017, and we've been working on this film since 2020. So it's more than 3 years in the making at this point, and. There's a matter of fitting it around everything else, but yeah, it's going to be good. It's going to be in depth. We're going to explore a lot of different parts of the history of that and the region here in the United States where it was first made. First made in the United States, not first made. Period.
Right.
So let me ask you a question before we jump off of that with the documentary. Here's one theory that I have. I think that people have dipped their toe in the absinthe and said, okay, I've tried it. And then they kind of dip out. And what they don't get is the romanticism of it. And as a person who did that early on, where it's like, hey, high alcohol, fun times, let's have fun. But then when you really start looking at the romanticism of it, and if you do it the right way, whether you really do the loose or not, the whole point is you're captivating everyone around the table. And you have to wait. So what do you do when you wait? You have a conversation. You
Yeah.
interact with people and you have a conversation. And I think there's a lot of people that they don't take the time to do that, whether they're doing sugar or not. But if they're just sitting there with dilution, you're like, all right, now we have a conversation and let's have a good time. And
Yeah.
I think I think there's just a lot of people that have forgotten that part of it and walked away and said, I've tried absinthe. But I don't think my opinion, you haven't really tried absinthe unless you've done that where you've interacted and discussed things with people.
Well, the great thing at the end of this film, I don't think this is going to be a spoiler or anything, but the film concludes with a conversation. It's a conversation in a building that was in a house that was a farmhouse at the time that this absinthe was being made, that we were trying to recreate. And there was 8 of us from all the different organizations that contributed to the project. And we did 4 at a time because I only had 4 microphones, so I could mic everybody up. but we sat around and talked about it. And the 2 groups are very different as far as the conversation that happened. It was interesting because it was the same group, and the 2 groups didn't necessarily reach the same conclusions. Everybody loved it, but there were different conversations. And so I think it's neat that you pointed that out because the culmination of the film is actually a conversation.
Very cool. Looking forward to that.
Thank you.
So, but thank you for coming on, Brian. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to having you back on. If we got time again, like we talked about, like what people are trying to recreate now is how close is it to reality? How close was it to reality back then? I think that's an interesting question.
That would be a fun one.
Yes. So thanks for coming on, Brian. We really appreciate it, and all the cocktails. They were fantastic. I was like taking a step into time. So remember, it's not the size of the den that matters; it's the love of whiskey. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers to you.
What?